And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the St. Louis Zoo tonight. We have a very fabulous lecture that I know you're all really dying to hear more about. But I'm going to take just a minute and let you know about some other things that we have going on coming up. We have another in our series of conservation conversations talks coming up on May 10th. The talk is titled Among the Giants, A Life with Whales. And we're really thrilled to be able to feature Charles, he goes by the name of Flip Nicklin. He's a marine biologist and a photographer who's well known for his nearly quarter-century worth of work photographing whales for the National Geographic. His talk here will be sponsored by the Explorers Club, the St. Louis chapter, Academy Science St. Louis, and the St. Louis Zoo. And he'll also be signing books. This is really going to be a fabulous, fabulous lecture. And one of the things that I am just really entranced by in this description of his talk, and I'm sure we're going to see wonderful photographs, he has the ability to free dive to depths of up to 90 feet, which is 27 meters. If any of you have ever tried to free dive while snorkeling, that's just fabulous. And it allows him to swim near enough to whales to record their behavior without interrupting it. So I think that's going to be really a thrill. In addition, we also, throughout the year, have additional talks on the whole topic of conservation. We like to feature our very own Wild Care Institute speakers. We will be working shortly to create and get out to you the list of talks for next year. Some of the topics that we're looking at have to do with Channel Island foxes, which is a real conservation success story that Dr. Cheryl Asa from our research department has been very instrumental in. We've also got talks on biomimicry, polar bears, and a wide variety of other really fascinating topics. So now I'd like to introduce Rose Jansen from the Academy of Science.
Well, good evening. My name is Rose, as Louise said, and I'm with the Academy of Science St. Louis. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a 150-year-old not-for-profit. We've been serving the St. Louis community and surrounding region for a very long time with a mission to advance the public understanding of science and inspire the next generation of scientists and science advocates. And we do that through a very broad range of free and low-cost public science programs, science seminar series, trips, tours that highlight science at venues, again, throughout the region. You can find more information on the Academy and our community-wide events and programs by visiting our website at academyofsciencestl.org. You can also visit us on Facebook or Twitter, or pick up some of the literature that I've brought along with me today. It's out on the visitor's desk. It may not have been here when you got here, but it is here now. If you'd like to receive e-notification of upcoming Academy and St. Louis Zoo public lectures and events, there will be some e-news sign-up sheets that will make their way around the audience. I'm going to mention just a couple upcoming public partnership events that you might have an interest in attending. This Friday, April 8th, botanist, conservationist, and author of the historic countryside of the Saxon Villages, Dr. John Ackroyd, is at the Missouri Botanical Garden from 4 to 5:30 p.m. as the 2011 John Dwyer Lecturer in Biology for a book signing and talk on Saxon Transylvania, Lost World, and Botanical Paradise. He talks about current projects that aim to conserve both the biodiversity and the European farming communities that have been maintained for more than 800 years in this species-rich countryside of the remote Saxon villages of southern Transylvania. This event is free and open to the public. On Wednesday, April 13th, the Academy hosts our 17th annual Outstanding St. Louis Scientist Awards Dinner. It's in the Starlight Ballroom at the Chase Park Plaza. The dinner celebrates and recognizes the impressive scientists and engineers of St. Louis, and you can find more information and ticket pricing on our website. There are some invitations on the visitor's desk in the lobby as well. In fact, our speaker tonight is one of those outstanding St. Louis scientists. On Saturday, April 16th, the Academy of Science leads a 6-hour baseline BioBlitz at Creve Coeur Park. This is a citizen science urban wildlife flash exploration and inventory of the biodiversity of the park's plant and animal life, and it's the park's first ever BioBlitz. It's open to anyone with an interest in learning more about the diversity of one of our area's treasured parks. We don't have all the information up on the website just yet, but it will be up there shortly in terms of signing up to attend. on April 19th at 7 p.m. in the Missouri History Museum's AT&T room. As part of our Perspectives on Science and History Partnership Series, we have anthropologist and archaeologist Carol Diaz-Granados. She'll be talking about American Indian art, imagery, and meaning. That same night at Kirkwood High School in the Keating Theater from 7 to 8:30 p.m., we have Southern Illinois University Edwardsville Assistant Research Professor, astronomer, writer, and Astronomy Cast podcaster, Dr. Pamela Gay. She will be talking about looking for life beyond Earth. On Thursday, April 21st at Kirkwood Community Center, and as part of our On Science series with Oasis from 1:30 to 3 p.m., we have Washington University psychology professor and author, Dr. Mark McDaniels. He'll be talking about memory. And I forgot to pick up the milk, some surprising findings on memory and aging and strategies for improving memory. And then last but not least, on Saturday, April 23rd at 1 p.m. at the History Museum, and as part of a new series on economics, in partnership with the museum, we have Boston College sociology and research professor Lisa Dodson. She will be talking about the moral underground, how ordinary Americans subvert an unfair economy. And again, you can find more information on these and additional science opportunities on our website or in some of the literature that we've left for you to take with you before you leave today. So with that said, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Timothy Holy is the 2009 Academy of Science St. Louis Outstanding St. Louis Scientist Innovation Award recipient and an associate professor of anatomy and neurobiology at Washington University in St. Louis. In his lab, his research focuses on studying the neural mechanisms of detecting and recognizing pheromones and developing new optical methods for imaging neuronal activity. They've developed a new method for imaging neuronal activity simultaneously in large neuronal populations. The principal advantage of this technique is that hundreds of thousands of neurons can be imaged at high speed and high signal-to-noise ratio. He's here with us tonight to talk about the neurobiology of animal social communication in squeaks and scents. So won't you please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Holy.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. So thank you very much, Rose, for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. So I'd like to begin by asking you to imagine yourself back about 100,000 years ago. And I'm going to show you two animals that were around at the time. The first you'll recognize as this animal, a tiger here. And I'm sure all of you will realize that this is a remarkably impressive specimen. So some members of this species can reach over 600 pounds in weight. They have these front teeth that can be up to 4 inches long. They can run at top speeds that are over 35 miles per hour. And this beautiful coat that they have, not only does it help them escape detection from animals that they would like to eat, but of course it also provides them with a little bit of protection as they go running through the brush at high speeds. So it's worth contrasting this very impressive animal with another animal that was alive at the same time, and that's this one here. And of course this one looks much less impressive in many ways. It's only about, let's say, a maximum of about 200 pounds or something like that. It doesn't have anything to speak of in terms of sharp teeth or sharp claws. The top running speed of around 20 miles an hour is relatively modest by comparison with this, for sure. And all this exposed skin makes this creature look incredibly vulnerable. And fast forwarding to the present, we all know how it worked out. So maybe in spite of the impressive advantages of this creature here, there are only about 4,000 of these left in the wild in the entire world today, whereas there are almost 7 billion of these creatures. And it's worth asking yourselves, how is it that a creature with so few seeming advantages has managed to do so well in comparison to this creature, which seems to possess so many more advantages? And I think all of you probably know many of the reasons for that. Some of the reasons are illustrated in this painting here. This is a small section of a painting of an event that happened in 333 BC. It was one of the battles of Alexander the Great, and this painting was painted in the early 1500s. And so there are certain elements of imagination to this painting, but I think it illustrates many of the things that work to the advantages of those humans. So the first of them is that you can see that this human has acquired something that's a little bit like that tooth, the sharp metal point of this spear here, with which it can inflict significant damage on any other creatures that might threaten it. You can see that it's formed a partnership with this animal here, the horse, that can run far faster than this person can. And finally, you can see that this person has protected itself by putting on clothing and even metal armor that allows it to withstand, again, attacks from others. And so over that 100,000 years, you can see that this human has become a much more fearsome creature. And so the technology that we developed certainly is a big part of what has made us so successful as a species. But this very same painting, it turns out we're only looking at a tiny portion of it. And if we look at a slightly larger portion of it, I think you can see another aspect of what it is that has made us so successful. And that's illustrated here. And this also illustrates one of the main differences between that tiger and ourselves, and that is that many tigers spend most of their lives, adult lives, living on their own. And so the activities that they engage in are determined by their own particular interests, whether or not they match with the interests of any of the other tigers. Whereas we as a species are capable of highly organized activity. And here you see a scene in which tens of thousands of individual people, they're not all agreeing with each other. In fact, they're fighting against each other. But on the two sides, each side, you have tens of thousands of people who are working towards a common purpose. Now, you might not like that purpose very much. I don't really like that purpose very much. But it nevertheless reveals some of the sort of power of our species, that we are capable of organizing the activities and labors of such a large number of people. Now, not all of the organized activities that humans engage in are so violent. So, for example, our ancestors were able to collaborate together to build monumental sculptures that survive until this day. More recently, amazing, beautiful, expansive works of art and architecture that enrich our lives are also brought about by collaboration. Astonishing feats of engineering that can connect people living in different portions of our world. And we even work together to, in some cases, leave our planet and build telescopes that let us study the sky and the origins of our universe and our place within it. And all of these tasks here are well beyond, of course, the capabilities of any one person. They all involve technology, and of course, no one could discover all the technology needed to do any of these tasks on his or her own. But they also involve many hands and organizing the work and activities of many people to a common purpose. And it's worth, of course, asking again in turn, after we've asked what is it that underlies our large success as a species, is what is it that underlies our ability to do these things? And one of the most common answers to this question is that it's communication. Now, when we think about communication, probably the first and arguably most important form of communication that comes to mind is speaking. This is an amazing human trait, and it's one that has been around for a very long time now, and we all get an amazing amount of benefit from that. And you also know, of course, that in modern times, the modes of communication have expanded. So some time ago, more recently, systems of writing were developed, and these were hugely important, of course, because they allow your communication to outlast the echoes of one person's speech, and in fact even outlive any one individual, so that the entire species can gain benefit from the communication of one person, for example. And of course, in even more modern times, our communication has gotten to the point where any one person can get in contact with any other person, essentially at any place on the planet. And not only are our communications voice to voice or person to person, but of course now the whole notion of communication has been broadened so that we're also communicating in information. And we build, in fact, entire rooms full of computers that are designed to store and organize, process, and deliver information to people who want to consume it. And so all of these modes of communication are really remarkable feats of humanity, and in large measure you can say that these are some of the central skills, or the central skills, that underlie our success as a species. Now, there is some reason to believe that these very sophisticated modes of communicating with each other could not have arisen if we didn't already have some motivation to work together. And in turn, the benefits of working together, therefore, might have depended upon earlier, somewhat more primitive modes of communication between people. And some of these are, again, going to be very familiar and perhaps obvious to many of you. One of the most common ones that's still very important today, of course, is body language or facial expressions. Probably everybody in this room could probably put a name to the emotion that is being communicated by each one of these faces. And this is something that surely predated our own ability to speak, and in fact is not unique to humans in any way, and allows the conveying of some, even as well, it's a much more limited type of information. It's often very important information that we would be much the worse off for if we weren't able to communicate that. Another example of communication that has gotten a lot of attention lately is illustrated by these images here. So as you'll recognize, these are 3 images of the same woman, and I'll ask you to sort of mentally compare them. And so if you sort of take this as your reference image and look at these 2 images, just ask yourself which of these 2 is a little bit more like this one. And of course, if you're like me, I would certainly personally pick this image as being more like this one, because she's looking directly at us in those 2 images, whereas in this picture she's looking off to the side. But I'll show you that this isn't necessarily, for instance, how a computer might look at the situation. And so if you, for instance, just take this image and compare it on a pixel by pixel level to these other 2 images, you might see something like this. So I'm going to use green to indicate no difference. So if you compare this image to itself, every pixel is, of course, the same as itself, and so you see a green rectangle here. Whereas if you compare this image to this one, then you can see some pixels indicated here in red that are brighter in this image. And you can see other pixels indicated here in blue that are brighter in this image. But you can see that the pixel by pixel differences are by and large pretty much restricted to the region just around the eyes. Whereas if you take a look at this image over here, you can see where she's tilted her head slightly. You can see that there are many more pixels with much more substantial differences between this image and this one than there are between this one and this one. So a computer might say, in fact, that these 2 images here are far closer to each other, and it might be hard to argue with that in some senses. But again, if you're like me, in terms of how you perceive these images, what they mean to you as a person, I at least would say that these 2 are more like each other. And that's revealing of the fact that we as humans pay a great deal of attention to the eyes. The eyes communicate very significant information to them, and so we focus on them a lot. And again, this isn't unique to humans, but it's something that's a little bit special in humans. If you compare our eyes to those of all other primates, you can see a striking difference. Anybody see what the difference is between the chimpanzee eyes and the human eyes? One of the differences? The whites of the eyes, I heard. Yes, exactly. So we as humans are actually unique in having such a large portion of the whites of our eyes exposed for the outside world to see. And it's been speculated that having the whites be visible allows us to much more accurately estimate what it is that another person is looking at. You can tell the difference often if you're talking to someone, whether they're looking you in the eye or whether they're looking at the small piece of spaghetti sauce that you've got, on your chin there, and you can tell that difference there. And part of that's because we can measure where another person's eyes are with great precision. And it's been, again, speculated that this was actually a very important form of early communication, because the ability to see what another person is paying attention to is focusing on both tells you something about what it is that they care about, but it maybe informs you about other things that you should be paying attention to. And it's also a way of, again, maybe organizing the collective behavior of a group of people. So social communication can take many different forms. Some of them are we think of immediately, talking and writing and all, but it can also assume maybe more subtle forms that we sometimes take for granted, body language, facial expressions, and just simply the direction of our gaze. Now, so we can, again, dig a little bit deeper and say, okay, so we as humans are special communicators, and so what is it that underlies this ability? Then if communication is really, in some senses, the foundation of our success as a species, what is it that underlies our success as communicators? And of course, the answer that probably all of you would come up to say is our remarkable brains, and you would be right. Humans have unusually large brains by comparison to other related animals that are around our size. And our brains are what allow us to, of course, to engage in these very sophisticated forms of communications that convey a lot of nuance and detail about maybe things that aren't just happening right at this very moment in time, but some distance in the future or some time in the past. And so it's even been speculated basically that the utility of social communication is a lot of what drove human evolution towards the development of a bigger and more capable brain. There's another perspective on all this too, and it's one that I find to be, in fact, one of the most fascinating perspectives, and that is that our brains, while they allow us to engage in what I would call an external communication task, that is me communicating with you and you communicating with me and all, the other thing that happens is that the brain has a big internal communication problem. As I'll show you in a moment, the brain is composed of many different components. In fact, billions of individual components. And what allows us to react to and communicate with the outside world is in part a reflection of the communication that's going on inside of our heads at any given moment. And to me, and I think many others, the attempt to understand this internal communication and how it generates the external communication that we do with each other is really one of the biggest, grandest challenges in science that there is. And that there has ever been. And so while it's a big task, and I think in many ways we as a community are still in the early phases of trying to understand these things, it's been an exciting several decades. And so a lot of what I'm going to be telling you about today is a very shallow look, if you will, at some of the progress that's been made in understanding this internal communication problem and how it generates the external communication that we and other species engage in. So I want to begin discussing this by talking about speech. And so this is an image of the human brain you'll probably recognize. And it turns out that the early days of neuroscience or neurobiology, the study of this brain, speech played a very major role. And one of the ways in which it played a role was that almost 200 years ago now, in a hospital in France, there was a patient by the name of Le Borgne. He was known, however, mostly by his nickname Tan, and he was named this because Tan was in fact the only word he could say. Despite being relatively normal in most other respects, he was and could understand spoken language, he had almost no ability to actually produce speech in any way. And he lived at this hospital for many years, and when he died, his doctor, Paul-Pierre Broca, decided to try to preserve his brain and to see if by studying his brain he could try to understand better what had been wrong with this patient. And so this is actually a real photograph of the preserved brain, taken obviously many years after it was preserved. And of course, there are many differences between it. So this has been essentially pickled for many, many years. So that's changed its appearance partly, and it's photographed under different conditions. But there was a difference that Broca noticed between this brain and this one here. And perhaps you can see it. It's this sort of large dark area right here. And you might think that's just simply essentially a shadow that comes from the conditions under which it was photographed, but in fact it's a bit of damage right there on the surface of the brain. And just so that you can sort of see better what that's like, I'll show you a slice of a brain from a different patient that has damage in a completely different area, but you can see this whole blackened area here of dead tissue inside of this brain, and that this lesion, as it's called, is in some way sort of similar to that. And so, and it turned out that Broca had, in fact, 2 patients that displayed very similar language deficits. And when the second patient died, then he too, it turned out, had a lesion in essentially the same part of this brain. And so this led him to hypothesize that this part of the brain might be the part of the brain that actually allows us to produce speech. And despite the fact that we actually now know that similar observations were made at least 25 years earlier by another person by the name of Mark Dax, this area has become known as Broca's area. And a few years later, there was another scientist, physician scientist working, who was studying patients with a different problem, and that was that they could talk, but they had almost no ability to understand spoken language. And it turns out that those patients had a lesion back here. And so in a span of only a few years, a theory evolved about how the brain produces speech and understands speech, and that it was essentially production was carried out in a region here, perception was carried out in a region here, and these two probably communicate with each other, and that this, at least a gross level, is how speech happens. This theory was actually quite influential for a very long time. But in recent times, its utility has become increasingly questioned. And largely that's through over time, our improved abilities to actually study brains. And in Broca's time, he didn't want to damage this brain, and so he could only look at the surface of it. But using some technology that I'll actually show you in just a minute, recently this whole brain was examined without touching it, but on the inside as well as on the out. And one of the surprising things that those investigators discovered is that this patient actually had damage to his brain in more than just this area. And other people had found out, in fact, that some people had speech problems when they didn't have any damage to this area, but damage in some other areas. And so the sort of simple picture that there's one part in your brain that produces your speech began to break down. An even more important development was the ability to actually study brain activity in living, breathing, behaving humans. And so this uses a technology called magnetic resonance image, and this is a person who's going to go into one of these MRI scanners. MRI is often used clinically to just peer on the inside of any part of your body. So if you have knee problems, you might get an MRI to see if there's some ripped cartilage or something in your knee. But it also turns out to be possible to visualize the brain. And importantly for our purposes today, one of the amazing things about MRI is that it can detect very small changes in the amount of oxygen that is carried by blood. And it turns out that when you are engaged in using a particular portion of your brain, that portion of your brain can be more metabolically active. It's burning more energy and it needs more oxygen. And so it turns out that MRI can actually detect the small changes in the amount of oxygen carried in your bloodstream that are a consequence of you engaging in certain mental tasks. And so it becomes possible to actually measure brain activity in a person. And one of the best places on earth to do this is here in St. Louis at Washington University. And in particular, a group here has been studying the process of speech and how what are the areas of the brain that are active during speech. And what they have found is that there are, in fact, a large number of areas of the brain that are active during speech. So this is a slightly different way of representing the brain. It's slightly inflated, and you're looking at it from different angles. So from one side, the other, from the top or the bottom. And for these two here, you're actually looking as if you're on the middle of the brain and looking towards the outside of the brain. And these patches shown in green here are regions in the brain that are very significantly active when the person who's lying down in this MRI scanner is actually talking. Okay? And what you can see is that, for instance, there is a region here that's active that very closely coincides with the region that Broca identified. And so that's reassuring that you find this area seems to be activated by speaking. But you can also see that there are many other areas of the brain that are also activated by speaking. And in a way, I think this is really a reassuring finding. If you think about your own process of speech, while, of course, this paints a much more complex picture of speech, it makes a certain amount of sense. When you think about the act of communicating with another person, you really do engage so many of your own capabilities, your cognitive capabilities. You can think new thoughts because of what you're listening to, or you can help the other person think new thoughts by what you're saying. You can excite different emotions and feelings in the other person, and similarly be the recipient of that. And so given that communication interacts so deeply with so many aspects of our own mental functioning, it's perhaps not surprising that so many portions of the brain are involved in producing meaningful speech. What about some of these simpler methods of communication? Okay, so facial expressions have been studied, and I'll show you one example here where subjects in an MRI scanner are not asked to generate any kind of communication, but they're simply asked to look at either a neutral face or a face of someone expressing fear. And when you look at the areas that are activated inside the brain there, you see, with this simpler form of communication, a somewhat simpler pattern of activation shown here. And while this is not the whole story of all of the areas in the brain that are activated, these authors were particularly interested in the fact that there's a region of the brain that's called the amygdala that seems to be involved in processing emotion, and often portions of it are specifically involved in fear. And sure enough, you can see that these particular areas light up in response to this form of social communication. So this is really amazing that we can peer inside of our own brains and see activity that reflects our own perception of the world, or our own production of sounds, speech and sounds. Now, I guess I would also say that this is only part of explaining how communication works. And these next images sort of, I think, introduce to you another aspect of this whole problem. And that is that if you imagine looking at a small portion of the brain, zooming in on it, and this is a portion that maybe is about the size of those regions that you saw activated in some of the previous images. If you were to blow this up, and here some dyes, different colored dyes have been applied to sort of help highlight some of the differences here, you can see that it's really quite beautiful looking structure when you zoom in on it with a microscope. And if you could imagine zooming in on this even further into a smaller and smaller area, you might imagine seeing something like this. And so what this is an image of a very small portion of the brain, and you're now looking at it at a cellular level. So where you can see individual cells. So like the rest of your body, your brain is composed of cells. And most cells in your body tend to be round. And of course, these cells also have a big round bit that's often called the cell body. But almost uniquely, not entirely uniquely, in your body, brain cells, these neurons, have these gorgeous branching wires, if you will, that they use to communicate with each other. And so these are called axons and dendrites. And what you can see is that in just this one tiny chunk of brain, that these neurons come in many different types. You can see some here that have these gorgeous tree-like branching patterns up here. You can see others that have very specific sort of draping waterfall-like connections with the cell bodies, specifically the cell bodies of these, and others where these wires climb up these trees and touch many portions of it. And so what you can see is that if you look in on a small scale, you can see that even on the small scale, when you get down to the individual cells, the brain is composed essentially of what look like circuits of specific patterns of connection that allow communication between the individual cells, the individual neurons in the brain. And these neurons are, in a sense, engaged in computing the same way that a computer does to help us communicate and, of course, all the other tasks that we perform with our brains. Now, this, I should hasten to point out, is not actually a photograph of what you would see if you looked at this region here. This is actually a drawing. It was a drawing that was made approximately 100 years ago by a famous Spanish neuroanatomist. And it was compiled laboriously by looking at many individual slices of brain that had been, in which, say, just one cell had been colored black, and all the others were essentially invisible. What's one of the amazing developments over the last couple of decades, and again, scientists in St. Louis played a major role in this, is it's now actually possible to start seeing these circuits in living color. And what I'm showing you here is a small section of the brain of a mouse, and this mouse's genes have been modified with a very clever design, a very clever trick that causes each one of these cells to essentially pick a random color to be. And so you see this whole riot of color where all the cell bodies of these individual neurons reside. But don't forget to notice over here all of these wires, these axons and dendrites that these cells have. And it's really in this region here where they're all tangled up together where a great deal of the computation that this section of the brain is engaged in carrying out. Okay? Now this is, just like those old images I showed you, it turns out that different portions of the brain, there's a lot of specificity in these brain circuits. So this is a portion of the brain called the hippocampus. If you look at a slightly different portion of the brain here, right at the surface of your brain, you see something that looks strikingly different, right? Completely different organization of the cells and of the wires that connect between them. And you might guess, and you'd be right, that these cells and circuits are probably carrying out very different kinds of tasks. And I think, at least for me, it's impossible to look at such gorgeous images and not want to know what are these individual cells in these circuits doing. And it's a beautiful and very daunting task, daunting especially when you remember that this chunk of brain that you're looking at corresponds to only a tiny, tiny portion of the whole, much smaller than this small red box that I can draw here. And overall, the whole human brain contains of the order of 100 billion neurons. It's about as many stars as there are in our whole galaxy. And the connections between the wires, between the neurons, called synapses, it's estimated that there are about 1 quadrillion, 1,000 trillion synapses in one human brain. Okay? So it's a very large task to try to understand how our communication is organized by activity in this incredibly beautiful and yet complex object. The other, of course, problem in thinking about the human brain, aside from its large size, is that our tools for being able to observe individual neurons and these circuits at the level of single cells is very limited, and in fact non-existent in living people right now, with a few exceptions, such as epilepsy patients. But the prospects for understanding this at a level of individual cells is much larger if we turn to animals. And fortunately, there are many animals that engage in social communication, from birds to mammals to insects. And like humans, animals derive a tremendous value from their social communication. One example, for example, is shown here with this termite. It's a small insect. And by working together, termites are actually capable of building these very large mounds, in some cases taller than a human being. And these mounds give the termites one advantage, which is some protection from predators, mostly other insects. But maybe less obviously, they in fact let these termites do some really amazing things. For example, some species of termites are actually farmers. They raise fungus for their own consumption. And in order to raise them well, you need a constant flow of fresh air through these houses. And more importantly, under the sort of radical conditions of this sunny landscape, you need to maintain the temperature inside of this fairly constant. And so these are effectively very sophisticated greenhouses that maintain a constant growing environment for the crops that these creatures raise. Okay? And this, again, is an example of a task that no single termite on its own could imagine undertaking, and yet by the cooperation of a very large number of individuals, they're able to do and build really remarkable structures. Now, I could give you, well, I don't know if I could, but certainly it would be possible to give you thousands of individual examples like this, but in the interest of trying to give you a little bit more depth about these processes, I'm really going to focus on a very narrow set of examples of animal communication. And one of the best studied and closest perhaps to our own is the phenomenon of birdsong. And so all of us are familiar with singing birds. This photograph shows the species that's most commonly studied in the laboratory. It's called the zebrafinch, and I'm just going to play for you the sound of a singing zebrafinch. I'm not going to play it. Here we go. So let me play this again. So it's probably not the most melodic bird song that you've ever heard, right? But it actually has, for a variety of reasons, this is a very useful bird to study. One of the features that it has that has made people excited about studying its song is that there are, in some ways, certainly not always, in some ways it's a little bit reminiscent of human speech. And one of the things, for instance, that speech has is that speech is learned. We're not born knowing how to talk. It's something that we have to learn. And indeed, these birds also have to learn how to sing. So I'm going to play for you a short movie that compares the song of an adult male zebrafinch, with that of a juvenile bird. So I think you can hear that sound of the young bird is far more disorganized than that of the older bird. When scientists study this phenomenon, it's helpful to have a way of visualizing the differences between these songs, and that's carried out by something that's called a sonogram, a picture, if you will, of sound. And this is the sonogram down here. This shows you the brighter colors indicate more sound power at a particular moment in the song. So time is on this axis here, but also at a given pitch. So low pitches are down here, and high pitches are up here. And you can see that individual sounds are blends of multiple different pitches here. And what I'll do is I will play the song for you here, and you'll actually get to sort of follow it along on the sonogram. I'll play this a couple of times so that you can sort of see how the visual representation of the song matches what you hear. So I'll play this again a couple times for you. So you can see those sort of squeaky sounds are these syllables right here, and the are these syllables right here that have the sort of upside down U's, if you will, stacked one on top of another. And so this gives one a way of actually seeing an image of what the song sounds like. And so using such images, you can see how a young bird's song progresses over time. So it turns out that young birds learn their songs from a tutor, often their dad. And so this shows you a sonogram of the song of an adult male, who's the tutor in this particular case. And it turns out that different adult males, if they're raised apart from each other, have recognizably different songs. They might arrange their syllables in different ways from each other. But each bird is internally consistent. It tends to produce the same song repeated times. Whereas if you contrast the song of a young bird, you can see that the individual syllables are very poorly formed by comparison with the adult, and there's no real obvious sort of temporal sequencing of these syllables. But over the course of time, as this young bird gets to listen to the tutor, You can see that the syllables, and of course it's also just simply practicing in the same way that young humans babble and make other sounds. You can see that it starts cleaning up its song, and in fact even putting its syllables in the same order as the tutor, until at the end, while it's not an exact copy of the tutor's song, you can see that it is remarkably similar. And if you had given it a different tutor, its song would have turned out to be a little more similar to that other tutor. So this phenomenon of song learning is one of the things that birds have in common with humans, and makes them an attractive system for trying to study human speech. Now, with birds, you can do things that are not possible with humans. And in particular, if you identify portions of the bird's brain that are important for song, like this portion up here, it's actually possible to implant a tiny wire inside of the brain and actually measure what's happening in single cells, single neurons in the brain. And I'll show you a little bit about what that's like by playing this movie here. You're going to see on the screen a representation of voltage as a function of time, but you'll also hear what happens if you pipe this to a speaker. So you see those individual sort of sharp changes in voltage, and that corresponds to activity of individual neurons. So this neuron is firing away, as we say, and it's by that firing that it's sending information to other neurons. And by doing experiments like this, the field has begun to get at least the beginning of an outline of how a bird might produce an organized sequence of events over time. This is non-trivial, right? Because the song might stretch out over many seconds, and while that doesn't sound like a hard thing to do, that neuron firing, as you saw, lasts for an incredibly short time, about a millisecond, and yet the bird has to organize its behavior over many seconds. So how do you go from something that lasts only a millisecond into something that has a structure and flow to it over many seconds? And a remarkable finding only a few years ago was found by recording from a particular subset of neurons in this bird's brain while it was singing. So you can implant these small electrodes and then you essentially glue it in place, if you will, and then wake the bird up from surgery and release it, and it'll fly around its cage and interact with other birds and eat and drink and sing. And if you record from these neurons while the bird is singing, then you see a remarkable pattern like this. One neuron here fired those clicking sounds, those spikes as they're called, only at the very beginning of this portion of the song, and it was completely silent during the rest of it. The second neuron fired a little later, another neuron fired yet later still, and so on. And so there are neurons that are only active, and these are the neurons that are essentially just one level upstream from the neurons that drive the muscles that produce the song. And a given neuron is active in only a tiny portion of the song, despite the fact that there are portions of the song that look very similar to each other. And this has given rise to one of our sort of first, let's say, concrete models of how we might engage in long, prolonged activities like the singing of a song or speaking. And the picture here is that there are really two components. One of them is a clock. And the way that this clock works, since these spikes only last such a short time, is that one neuron fires for a short period of time and then effectively hands the baton off to another neuron, and it's its turn to activate. And then that passes the baton to another one, and so on. And so they just take turns being active. And you can imagine this may be going around in a loop so that you get repetitive behavior many times. And so this effectively acts just like a clock. It's keeping time, seeing how far, measuring how far into the song you are. And then the second component of it, and the part that is speculated to be the learning part of it, is to connect these individual stages in the clock to essentially individual muscles, if you will, in producing song. So here's a neuron that you know is only going to be active in this portion of the song, and so if you want the song to sound in a certain way, and that process is one that's still under active investigation, then you should make a specific connection with certain muscles that will produce that particular sound. So this is a very simple, very direct, mechanistic view of how you might generate a very complex behavior like speaking or like song. Now, birds are fantastic for many of these studies, but of course one might wonder, is this unique to birds? And we don't yet know the answer to that. But one way to do that would be to study singing in mammals, for example. And there are mammals that are well known for their song, and probably the most famous of these are the whales, which make these amazing sounds. But for reasons that I'm sure you can imagine, whales are not the most convenient animal to house in your laboratory. And so probably the most favored animal of all is the mouse. And mice, too, make lovely sounds like that. But that doesn't seem very useful if you want to study speech or singing. And it turns out that in our lab a few years ago, we were intrigued by reports that other people had made suggesting that mice, in addition to the famous squeak that they make sounds at very high frequencies, at pitches, in fact, that are called ultrasonic because we as humans can't hear them. And these sounds had been recorded by relatively simple technology in the past, and so there wasn't really much known about them. And for some maybe surprising reasons, we decided we should go off and record them. And when we did so, and we looked at the sonograms, which you've now seen several times, we noticed that these looked much more organized than, let's say, the noise, perhaps, that we expected to be somewhat similar to the noise they make when they squeak. And so we wanted to listen to them, but as I said, these are actually at frequencies, 50 kilohertz or so, or higher, that our ears aren't even sensitive to, so we can't hear them. And so we decided, though, that because we really wanted to hear them, that we had to come up with a way to do that. And so one way to do that is to just slow it down, and that has the effect in the same way if you've ever heard, let's say, for those of you who might remember these days, a cassette tape played slowly, all the pitches drop. And so if you slow this down by a lot, this is just a 2-second stretch here, and if you slow it down 16 times, this is what you hear. So that sounded kind of interesting and maybe a little bit reminiscent of the whales, though obviously at a higher pitch. We developed actually another way to listen to these things, and that is to essentially mathematically shift the pitches down, but keeping it at the same speed that it was originally. And that sounds like this. Okay? And to us, that sounded a lot like birdsong. And I think it gets even more convincing if you listen to a slightly longer stretch of this. Is this one not going to work? My apologies. Well, we can figure that one out later. My apologies there. But in fact, it turns out that mice will engage in this behavior sometimes for periods of up to 10 minutes or so, chattering away to themselves. And that, for those reasons in part, we felt that they sounded a lot like song. And it turns out that you can see a lot of similarities between birdsong and mouse song. And that is that you can see a progression of syllables of different types, in the same way that birdsong is organized into syllables of different types. And you can even find cases, although they're rarer in mice than they are in birds, where the mouse is clearly repeating itself. Here's once, twice, and a third time. And so these are often known as motifs in the birdsong literature. And so it turns out that mice have many of the elements of the most sort of commonly studied bird songs. Now, why is this interesting? Well, one of the reasons why this is interesting is that mice are easier to look at the effects of individual genes than is the case for birds. And they're also more closely related to us. And over time, it's begun to be realized that some aspects of our communication in humans can be traced down, in some cases, to individual genes. I'm going to show you one example of that here. This is actually a collaborator of ours who was studying the phenomenon of stuttering in Pakistan. And what they found was this is a family tree. And the main thing to note is that some of the individuals in this tree are shown in black and others are shown in white. And the ones filled in black are individuals who stutter. And it turns out that this is a strongly inherited, in this particular family, is a very strongly inherited trait. These folks were actually able to trace this, the cause of this stuttering mostly to one single gene. And they actually know how that gene is mutated in the individuals who stutter and what it looks like in the individuals who don't stutter. And one of the things that we're doing right now is that they are genetically modifying mice to have the exact same mutation as humans, and that should hopefully allow us to get better insight into what goes wrong at the level of the brain, at the level of the individual genes in a human communication disease such as stuttering. Now, so that's one aspect of animal communication, one that we have made some study of. I want to close by talking about another one, and it's actually the most common form of social communication across the whole animal kingdom, and that is the process of using chemical cues, sometimes called pheromones. And this shows you an example in the insect world where this was sort of first worked out, where here you have an example of a male insect of a moth species releasing a plume of this pheromone chemical into the wind. And here you have the female with her gorgeous antenna, which is what she uses to detect this particular chemical. And she's moving towards the source of this pheromone. And the behavior has been described in some detail, where when she gets wind of the scent, so to speak, she surges upwind towards the source of the scent. If she happens to lose the scent, she engages in a behavior called casting, where she searches from side to side, and then when she reacquires the scent, she moves upwind again, etc., until she gets to the source of the scent. Now, while this process of communication by scent and pheromones was sort of first and best worked out in the case of insects, mammals engage in this behavior too. If you browse the web, you'll find claims that another species also uses pheromones in its communications. And you can see in this case that the female has become so excited by this scent that she's knocked the male from his perch down onto the floor. So, of course, this is a company that's trying to sell you something, and perhaps you shouldn't believe everything that you hear from a company that's trying to sell you something. A little bit of skepticism about this might be advisable, but we at least decided to try to follow their advice and find out more about how this kind of process might work out. And so I'll show you, let's say, a slightly more realistic example of chemical communication among animals. These are not large mice. These are kangaroos, and these kangaroos have an interesting social structure in which the males box with each other for the right to mate with a large harem of females. And you're going to see a form of male-female communication interaction that may be surprising to you. So here's the female, and here's the male. And we're about to see them interact in a way that involves these social chemical signals, these pheromones. And if you're eating something, probably none of you are, I would recommend you stop right now. So what you can see, and this is a common behavior you can see in many of the animals here at the zoo, is that he's, of course, sampling some of the chemicals that are in the female's urine. And interestingly, this male, after this interaction, even though he sort of had earned the right, if you will, to mate with this female, decided not to do so. And in my lab, one of the things we want to know is why. What is it that he learned from this interaction that made him decide not to engage in a behavior that might otherwise seem like an advantage for him? And so we decided to try to study how the brain perceives these individual social communication scents. And I've just shown you this process of recording from neurons in the brain using electrodes, where you can measure the spikes of individual cells. I'm going to show you another way of measuring brain activity, one that's a much newer way of doing it now. Not necessarily better, although, as you'll see, it has some nice advantages. And that is actually by looking at neurons. And the key behind this is it turns out that we as scientists, I take no credit for this, have developed ways of putting chemicals inside of individual cells that measure the amount of calcium. and that's inside the cell. So calcium you might know as a nutrient, but it's important for a wide variety of functions in our bodies and in our brains. And in particular, calcium inside of a cell is usually at very low concentration, but calcium outside of a cell is at higher concentration. But when a neuron spikes like this, then pores in the membrane open up, and calcium can flow inside, and it can bind to these chemicals that change their interaction with light when calcium is bound, and let us actually see then the neurons that are active. And so in my laboratory, we developed a new way of a new type of microscope that lets us actually watch large portions of the brain as it's engaged in social communication, if you will. And we study, for the images I'll show you here, we're studying neurons that are for the first images at least, they're taken from inside the nose of the mouse. This is the part of the nose that detects some of these social signals in urine, for example. And those neurons live in an area called the vomeronasal organ. There's no need to remember that name, sitting right here. I'll also show you some images of brain activity in a portion here that's pretty near the front part of the brain. And we can, and this part in the nose is the part that actually detects chemicals in urine, for example, and other socially relevant cues. And each one of these neurons, as you'll see, is in charge of detecting a small number of chemicals, but there are, turns out, many types of these neurons, about 300. And this, in principle, lets the animal detect many different smells. And so this is an actual image of these neurons in this tissue responding to different chemicals. And these names just indicate different chemicals. And hopefully what you're able to see are flashes in these individual neurons. So you're actually able to watch these neurons in the act of detecting individual chemicals. And so you see these flickers here lighting up. Some of that is spontaneous. Neurons are active on their own, but also these neurons are active in response to smelling particular things. And this shows you one image of the brain, but one of the fun things that we've been able to do lately is we can actually visualize this activity in a full 3 dimensions. And when we do that, and when you render it this way, this is what you see. So this is a whole region containing many thousands of neurons, and you can see these coordinated flashes indicating those cells that are recognizing particular odors lighting up in response to the presentation of those odors. We can also not only image what's going on in the nose in response to these social cues, but we can also see what's happening farther in the brain. And in particular, we've been able to find that there are particular portions in the brain that are responsive, for instance, to cues that are contained in the urine from males versus the urine from females. And I'll just show you a movie of that. Again, this is rocking just to help you visualize the 3D. Stimulus pulse is going to come here. You should see regions here lighting up in response to female mouse urine, and if you saw it here, regions, very different regions lighting up in response to male cues. And so we're starting to able to essentially map out the individual areas that are responsive to particular types of cues. Of course, another thing that this has allowed us to do, and I'm not going to show you how we did this, but combining this ability to study the individual neurons with chemistry, we've been able to finally get some clue about what it is that they're actually smelling. And it turns out that what seems to be much of the answer is that they're smelling steroids. Now, you may have heard of steroids in light of sports scandals, but you may also know that steroids are part of what control essentially our whole body's physiology, how aggressive or not we are, dominant in the case of a mouse, for example, what stage of the estrous cycle they're in, etc. And in a way, what this has given us a picture of is different from this popular image of pheromones, of social communication using chemicals. One that I think is a little bit more in agreement with what you actually see in the real world, which is that rather than being some sort of magical signal that one member emits to sort of make the other engage in behavior that might not be to her advantage necessarily, Instead, what we sort of think about this now is almost more of a form of identity theft. You could learn a lot about me by going through my trash. You could find out who asks me for money, what magazines I read, and things like that. And similarly, by going through her trash and measuring the very signals that set her own status within the social group, for example, this animal is getting essentially an inside look at who this is. And so we think that that's a very important sort of new view of the purpose and nature of social communication among animals. So with that, I just want to close and summarize what I've talked to you about. The first is, of course, is that social communication is an incredibly important phenomenon. It allows animals, including ourselves, to tackle challenges that are far too large for any one individual. And it is indeed a major part, perhaps if you had to pick one, the major part of what it is that makes us human. It's a form of, or social communication can involve many different forms, including sights and sounds and smells or even touch. And the final thing is that by studying the process of how the brain arranges and organizes social communication is proving to be a window into the brain itself and teach us how about this organ, which is perhaps, again, one of the greatest mysteries left to us, how it functions in both health and disease. I'd like to also just simply make sure that I don't leave you with a false impression that we've done all of the work that I talked about. I borrowed a lot of things from many different sources, some of which are sort of in the general scientific knowledge, of course, and a few specific points from other labs that I'd just like to acknowledge here. And most importantly, I'd also like to acknowledge the folks that I've had the pleasure of working with over a number of years tackling some of these interesting social communication questions in mice. And with that, I'd like to stop and ask you if you have any questions. Yes?
When you have the neuron dendritic tree, it's looking for a chemical to stimulate. If it doesn't find that chemical, will it proliferate into the larger dendritic tree? And conversely, if it never gets stimulated for the dendritic tree, that tree has collapsed. What would happen to that baby bird if it weren't around any adult birds?
Very, very good question. So just in case some of you at the back can't hear it, the question is one of how is the structure of the brain affected by the experience of the animal, if I may paraphrase it in that way. So if a neuron in the nose that's tuned to receive a particular chemical, in fact, never detects that chemical, will it wither and die? Will it get bigger, questing for a source of this chemical? Or if a bird never hears the songs of another bird, what happens? Do the song-specific neurons, do they tend to wither away and die? And so it turns out that there's no one answer to that question, but the general sort of pattern is that indeed the structure of the nervous system is affected by experience. And so for instance, some of that is maybe, it's also, you could say, driving experience too. So for instance, in birds, in many species, the song areas actually grow in size during the season of reproduction. And some of that is driven internally by hormones, but there is also evidence that at least that under some circumstances, specific brain areas that aren't used assume less importance. And one of the earliest and most compelling examples of this was just what happens if you block one eye over time. And it turns out that the other eye's influence over the brain expands to sort of fill the empty space left by when one eye is covered. And so, in fact, that's had very important implications for kids born with vision deficits in one eye, the need to treat them very early for those deficits. And in some cases, if you can't get to the treatment right away, it's actually better to cover the second eye too, to prevent it from essentially overwhelming the first eye in an irreversible fashion. And then when this condition can be corrected, then both eyes are available again. So definitely experience can shape the very architecture of the brain. Other questions? Yeah.
How far back in the evolutionary phyla
Again, a very good question. Question is, how much do the brains of different species have in common? So are there appreciable similarities between the brains of birds and people, mice and people? What about even insects, for example? And so perhaps unsurprisingly, the farther you get from humans, the more differences there appear to be. But I think one of the things that's been appreciated over the last decade or so is that some things that look quite different actually turn out to have a common origin or be having a common function. And it's just sometimes maybe the visual appearance of an area may change, but now that we have the ability to actually look at the individual molecules that specify the fate of a particular portion of the brain, we're starting to see very strong similarities, not just between, for instance, mouse brains and human brains, but even bird brains and human brains. And there are even some examples of this when you go as distantly as insects. This sense of smell that we study, there are shocking similarities between the first portion of the brain that processes smells in an insect and in us. And to this day, we don't really know whether that reflects a common evolutionary heritage that we share with insects, or whether it was something that arose later independently in each line and that somehow stumbled on some sort of common architecture. That's, of course, not to say that everything is common. There are obvious differences in the behavior between humans and insects, and unsurprisingly, there are very important differences in the brains. But I think the sort of surprising thing over the last decade or so has been the degree to which you can identify genuine points of commonality between even insect brains and people, but certainly birds and people. Any other questions? Yeah. So a great question. So the question is, males will mimic another male typically. What do the females do? So the birdsong field has been a little bit more focused on the males, and there actually is a good reason for that, and that is that the males are the ones that tend to sing by far the more elaborate songs. There are species of birds for which males and females both sing sophisticated songs, but for reasons that I don't think are related to that, those tend not to be species that are bred in captivity. So they just don't have a history of captivity with humans. And whereas these finches, for example, do. And it's really the males there that are the only ones that engage in very sophisticated song. And so I'm sure it's been looked at. I don't know the answer since I'm not actually personally in that field. To what extent it's been looked at to the vocalizations that females make, how much are those learned, for instance, from other tutors or not, but it's not nearly as spectacular as what you see in the males, for sure. Any other questions? Yeah?
Do the bird vocalizations vary with the conditions that are here, whether it's food, whatever?
Yeah, another good question. So do the vocalizations vary under the conditions? And that's absolutely the case. So some species of birds have multiple songs that they can sing, and they might use those songs in different contexts. So for example, some species of birds have what would be called sort of a territorial song, which is really primarily directed at other males and seems to have the meaning, please stay away from my territory. And then they might have a different song, which is more of a courtship song, which seems to be directed at the females and to try to attract them to his own territory. There are other but there aren't general rules about that. There are species of birds that seem to really just have one song, and that one song might convey multiple meanings. That is that if a male is listening to it, it might be essentially a competitive threat, whereas if a female is listening to it, it might be evaluated for its attractiveness in some fashion or another. But the birds that have the most sophisticated repertoires tend to use that repertoire in a sort of a specific way appropriate to the circumstance. Any others? I can't, some of the people are more in shadow, so if you're raising your hand, I may have a harder time seeing it, so. Yeah.
Has a study ever been done to see whether those birds that are able to communicate speech, whether there are different patterns of activation?
Yes, great question. So some species of birds, like parrots, for example, can produce fairly impressive copies of the sounds of human speech. I wouldn't say it's never been done, but parrots are sort of just not, they're more sort of precious animals, and so I think there have been fewer studies done of their nervous system than of many other birds, and some of those are certainly anatomical after the birds died, but in terms of sort of the, it's not a common thing to do to actually record from a parrot brain, unfortunately, there. So it's a fascinating question. So we wonder if the mechanisms that parrots and we use in producing our speech may be essentially souped up variants of what we're seeing in the zebrafinch song, but at the moment we don't really know if that's the case. Yeah, at the back.
I'm wondering, as a human, it's easier to follow that steroids and pheromones and hormones drive our instincts, but how would a bird song, to me, I'm having a hard time, why would a bird song be an attractive form of communication? And is maybe that driven by steroids or some other molecular level?
Yeah. Very, very good question. So yes, one of I think the reasons why we think that the smell is a particularly tractable problem to tackle is because of the sort of immediacy and immediate relevance of the cues there. With something like birdsong, it's a little harder to understand what is it about the song that is the source of interest. So one of the principles that's very important in these questions is this idea of honest signaling, which I sort of alluded to in one of the titles of my slides. And that is that if you're going to pay attention to a cue, and you're going to try to extract meaning from it, you should hope that the animal that's making the communication isn't lying in some fashion or another, right? So if I'm able to lie to you, then say I'm really fit, and you fall for it, that's not to your advantage for sure, right? And so there's a real evolutionary pressure to pay attention to cues that are reflective of the true state of the other animal rather than whatever they might want to advertise about themselves. And so again, in birdsong, it's a mix of very beautiful, solid experiments and some degree of speculation. But there's quite a lot of evidence now to indicate that at least certainly the amount of singing that an individual male is able to engage in is reflective in some fashion of his fitness. So it turns out that singing takes quite a lot of energy, and so he has to be healthy enough to maintain that energy output. It also, as you know, birds have to eat an awful lot because they're incredibly metabolically active, and so any time spent singing is time spent not foraging for food, for example. And so again, it's going to be the males that are most fit that may be able to allocate the most resources to this process of trying to attract a mate, and the females cue off of that for that reason. What's been a little bit more controversial is the degree to which the actual quality of the song matters for this selection process. And there have been some studies that have shown that a male that learns a really refined song is more successful. But there are other studies that have shown a really what was at that time a really unexpected finding, which is that if you raise a male in isolation, he produces a pretty different song from ones that have been raised by other birds. And at least in one experiment, those songs are more attractive to the females, the sort of innate song rather than the learned song. So I would say it's still a little bit open for investigation of what the actual reproductive purpose of learned song is. But certainly the ability to sing, there's pretty clear evidence that that's a marker of the fitness. Great questions. Yeah. Again, another really great question. So the question is, to what degree why does a zebrafinch sound like a zebrafinch? Is it because it's been tutored by other zebrafinches, or is there something in that bird's innate makeup that causes it to sing a song that sounds like a zebrafinch? And the answer is a mix of both. Both are true. So zebrafinches have only a certain range of sounds that they can physically make, for example, right? And because of different shapes in their vocal tracts and beaks and all, there are differences, for instance, from what a canary can do, for example. Nevertheless, if you take a zebrafinch and you raise it, but you have canary parents that raise this zebrafinch, then you will hear a zebrafinch song. I wish I had some examples to play for you here, that has borrowed very clear canary-like elements to it. So to the extent that its vocal hardware permits it, it's trying to actually imitate the canary song. It's also possible, of course, that its neural hardware is limiting that in some fashion as well, that it's not just what it physically can produce, but what it mentally can produce may be partially wired to make a zebra-finch song. There's another really interesting experiment, and this goes back to the previous question a little bit. If you raise a zebrafinch in isolation, then it produces a very different song from a zebrafinch that's been tutored by others. But what's interesting is that if you start a colony from an isolate, and so that the only tutors available are ones that had never heard the sort of full zebrafinch song, but made it up, if you will, as they went. Over the generations, it turns out that the song that the progeny starts singing becomes more and more like what we think of as regular zebrafinch song. We don't really understand why, but one of the best guesses is that the innate component is not now of production, but of preference. And that is that there's a certain type of song that zebrafinches are, to some extent at least, hardwired to appreciate. And the males are conducting experiments trying to figure out what it is that works and what doesn't work. And over time, that preference by the females encourages the males to sort of fall into the default zebrafinch sound, basically. Yeah?
Anything to say about mockingbirds?
The mockingbirds are amazing animals. So I wish I understood them better. They are certainly among the most impressive vocal mimics, and they're also just incredibly intelligent animals. I don't, though, have anything really concrete to say in terms of what are the differences between, for instance, their brains or their vocal apparatus and other animals. Their vocal apparatus is impressive, but it's not strikingly different from that of many other birds. And so their ability to mock presumably comes down to differences in their brain than anything else. But again, like parrots, they've not been a species that's been very extensively studied in a laboratory setting. Yeah. So the question is, are we the only species that likes to sing for pleasure? So it's a great question. I'm not sure I can give you a completely concrete answer to that, but there aren't very many outside of humans and whales and birds. It's not like every critter on Earth sings, for example, right? So it was a surprise that mice do and bats do. It's been, of course, insects sing too, right? You hear the sound of that for frogs and other things like that. So it's not a phenomenally rare thing, but it tends to be more unusual than common. I think it's hard to know for certain whether an animal is deriving pleasure from something, but there are certain molecular cues that seem to be correlated with pleasure. There's a neurotransmitter called dopamine that gets released in particular portions of our brains, often when we're feeling pleasure or reward of some fashion or another. And it turns out that there are circumstances in which singing is rewarding or listening to song is rewarding even for animals, as measured by this dopamine release. And it's not maybe necessarily as rewarding as some other rewards that you can give in and of itself, but we don't need the maximum. We're motivated by things besides a meal, for example, and so too are many animals. And so there is a sense in which one might be able to say that some animals will sing for the pleasure of it, although it's usually correlated with some, again, sort of, let's say, function that enhances their reproductive success or survival or something other like that. Yeah.
The vocalization patterns of wolves considered to be songs.
Vocalization patterns of wolves?
That considered to be song patterns like birds.
Right, good question. So do wolves sing? So, because one of the things that I should say is that there's no, I think anytime you try to define a term like song, you will find a difference of opinion of what constitutes a useful definition. And so, I think there are circumstances under which you might say that the wolves are singing songs. The vocalizations, whether they are songs or not, that wolves make are somewhat simpler than those, in fact, that zebra finches make. And one of the most important differences is that there's no evidence yet, at least, that wolves have to do any learning on their vocalizations. They don't seem to change their pattern of vocalization depending on their experience in any way that anyone has detected yet. And so, and they also aren't as rich in terms of a diversity of syllables or temporal sequences and things like that. So, you could say in one sense maybe they're a very simple form of song, or you could try to reserve song for a more sophisticated behavior that brings in some of these other elements. In some ways it's a semantic issue, but there certainly are simpler than what you get out of a good songbird. Yeah.
You said you studied a family tree.
Not us. Some of our collaborators did, right? Yeah.
The family tree of people who stuttered, and you found there was a gene that was responsible for that. Why is it that person who stutters, who has that defect, doesn't stutter when they sing?
A terrific question. So an interesting fact about stuttering, which is that for many people who stutter when they speak, they don't stutter when they sing. And I think, so I at least don't know at a deep level why that happens. So stuttering seems to be a really, it's an interesting and complex behavior, and it's sort of not, it involves this whole ability to generate complex sequences. There may be some interesting relationships with other sort of motor deficits, potentially even like Parkinson's. I mean, it's very different from Parkinson's, but there may be underlying principles that apply to the study of both of those. And Parkinson's patients, for example, also display interesting phenomena like that. So, for example, someone may have a hard time making a movement in a particular direction, but if they rhythmically tap their hand, all of a sudden they feel free. And similarly, many Parkinson's patients sometimes have a hard time walking, but believe it or not, they can ride a bicycle just fine, right? And so what is about the rhythmic pedaling of a bicycle that's different about the rhythmic stepping? I don't think there's really a concrete understanding of that yet. But there's something that gets these chains of activity that I described for the Birdsong kind of going, and we don't understand all the triggers that get them started or what it is that can go wrong when they unexpectedly stop, for example. Yeah.
Does anybody done a study of the range of information the dog gets from sniffing fire?
Great question. So how much information can a dog get from sniffing? I would love to know the answer to that. Don't know yet. Ask me in 20 years. Not that we're studying dogs, but I mean the sort of spirit of that question. I mean, yeah, it's a terrific question. So, yeah, towards the back.
Yeah, could you comment on birds that are brood parasites, where the young birds are not reared by their own parents? How, for example, in brown-headed cowbirds,
Yep.
males end up hurting their sons?
Yeah, great question. So So the question is, some birds are effectively parasites, meaning that the parents will lay the egg not in their own nest, but in the nest of another bird. Those other bird parents then have all of the difficulties and burdens of raising young that's not their own. And the question is, how do those birds then end up learning the proper song to be attractive to other members of their species? So I wish I knew more about that. I don't know, and I'm sure it's a question that's actually been looked at. I think, at least in the case of the cowbird, the example that you mentioned there, if I'm remembering correctly, they have a relatively simple song. But I even could be wrong about that. So fundamentally, I don't actually really know how that process works. But much of the learning of birdsong actually happens, it's not in the very, very early youth, if you will, of a bird. So in the zebrafinches, that sort of critical period for learning tends to start at around 40 days or so. So the bird is actually physically mature, not sexually mature, but sort of physically mature at that age, and is capable of leaving the nest at that point. So there are opportunities to learn a sophisticated song after the initial rearing is done. All right, thank you so much for coming and asking all those wonderful questions. Have a terrific evening.